Hello, students. We are going to continue on in our Chapter 5 notes with Lesson 4, Declaring Independence. And we are looking under the title, The Second Continental Congress. You may remember when we talked about the First Continental Congress, I said that with each newly elected group of members, they changed the number of the Continental Congress. So they have elected new members to Congress, and now it is the Second Continental Congress. And I am going to read under distinguished leaders. Now, this one is a question that we are going to have to find or create based on the answer that we have here. And our answer is May 10th, 1775. So I'm going to read under distinguished leaders. The Second Continental Congress met on May 10th, 1775. The delegates included some of the greatest leaders in the colonies. Among them were John and Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and George Washington, all delegates to the First Continental Congress. Several new delegates came as well. We're going to pause there because we have a place that we can look to find our question. So our answer was May 10th, 1775, right? So according to that paragraph, something happened on May 10th, 1775. So our question has to go along with that. And so it has to do with the Second Continental Congress, right? That was our very first sentence. So when did the Second Continental Congress meet could be the question, right? Because that's what it says. The Second Continental Congress met on May 10th, 1775. So that could be our question. I worded it a little bit differently than that. You can word it the same way as I did, or you can word it a little differently. I've said this every single time. It doesn't have to look exactly the same, but it definitely has to have the part about the Second Continental Congress is what we're talking about, and that they met on May 10th, 1775. So when was the Second Continental Congress assembled? Or you can write, when did the Second Continental Congress meet? So number 2 says, who were some delegates that were new to the Second Continental Congress? And in that paragraph that I read, it listed off some of the members who were still part of the Continental Congress, but they actually were elected for the First Continental Congress. So they're members who are staying on the Congress. And this is asking about new members. So we're going to read on to find who our new members are. So Benjamin Franklin, one of the most respected men in the colonies, had been a leader in Pennsylvania legislature. In 1765, he represented the colonies in London and helped win the repeal of the Stamp Act. John Hancock of Massachusetts was a wealthy merchant. He funded many patriot groups, including the Sons of Liberty. The delegates chose Hancock to be president of the Second Continental Congress. Thomas Jefferson, only 32, was also a delegate. He served in the Virginia legislature. Jefferson was already known as a brilliant thinker and writer. So we've got 3 men who are listed here in this paragraph who are going to be new members on our Continental Congress. And they're not the only new members, but they're important new members and men who we are going to see again coming up, men who are important historical figures for our country. So our first one is Benjamin Franklin, and we have learned a little bit about Benjamin Franklin. Again, you probably knew a little bit about Benjamin Franklin before we even talked about him. Our second one is John Hancock, and he was elected president of the Continental Congress. So CC I did for Continental Congress, okay? I will go ahead and put a little note in here that means Continental Congress. And as I usually tell you, if you will remember that that's what that means, we'll do it like that. Then you can just put in CC. But if you're not sure what that is, or later on, if you go back to look at your notes and you are clueless about what CC means, then make sure that you put in Continental Congress, okay? That looks a little weird. I don't know why it's kind of faded out there. Let's see what I can do. There we go. Maybe that's better. It's just too small. Okay, so our third delegate, and delegate means representative. We've seen this word before, and I've told you before what it means, is Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so our 3 new members to the Continental Congress. And then the next question is, what did the delegates decide about independence? So for that, we need to read on a little bit here. The delegates at the Second Continental Congress had much to discuss. Though American and British blood had been spilled, they were not ready to vote for a break from Britain. It would be another year before Jefferson would write the Declaration of Independence. So, what did the delegates decide about independence? Well, they weren't really ready to decide anything. Even though they still, had these feelings that they wanted to be separate from Great Britain, they weren't really sure if it was the right thing to do. So they decided that they were not ready to break away from Great Britain. So they actually will not talk about declaring independence until another year later. So we're going to have another year of fighting before we even get to a point where they're going to write the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to go ahead and give you a moment to make sure that you have that information before I move on to the next part. I will move ahead in the text and get that ready though. Okay, I'm going to move on, but I'm going to leave the notes up there on the screen and I'll just preview the question and then I'll read the information in case you still need that there to type into your notes. So under key actions is where we're looking next in our notes. And the question is, how did the Second Continental Congress govern the colonies? And we're actually looking for 4 answers for this question. So I will begin to read. The Continental Congress did take steps to begin governing the colonies. It authorized the printing of money and set up a post office with Franklin in charge. The Congress also formed committees to handle relations with Native Americans and foreign countries. Most important, it created the Continental Army. Unlike local militias, such a force could form and carry out an overall strategy for fighting the British. The Congress unanimously chose George Washington to command this army. Excuse me. Washington was an experienced soldier and a respected Southern planter. He left Philadelphia at once to take charge of the forces in Boston. Okay, so I'm going to forward here to our next page. And again, our question was, how did the Second Continental Congress govern the colonies? I'm going to actually move this over slightly so we can see the numbers on this one. Okay, so we have, when we look over here in our notes, they took steps to begin governing the colonies. So one of the things that they did was authorize the printing of money, and they set up a post office. So even though they're kind of come together there in the text, they're actually 2 separate answers because they're definitely 2 separate things. So they authorize and print money, and they set up a post office. Then the Congress also formed committees to handle relations with Native Americans and foreign countries. And most importantly, it created the Continental Army. And I am going to give you a moment there to get that information in. Now, our next question, we actually got the answer to that in that same paragraph. So who was chosen to command the Continental Army? Well, the Congress unanimously chose George Washington to command the army. So unanimously means that every single one of them voted to have George Washington command the Continental Army. We had seen George Washington come into the picture in the French and Indian War as a very young man and had worked his way up in those ranks. And he was now an experienced soldier and he was respected by others. And so they all thought that he was going to be the best choice for the commander of the Continental Army. So number 3, we're looking for a definition of this word petition. You may know a definition of this word, but it's probably a little bit different than what you're thinking. I am going to, again, continue to read here. The delegates then offered Britain a last chance to avoid war. They sent a petition or a formal request to George III called the Olive Branch Petition. It assured the king that the colonists wanted peace. It asked him to protect the colonists' rights. The king rejected the petition. Instead, he prepared for war. He hired more than 30,000 German troops called Hessians to fight alongside British troops. So petition, again, it's highlighted there, which we've seen in the text before for a lot of vocabulary words. And I last time figured out that if you clicked on it, that it popped up there with the definition as well. So that was a new thing for me to see. So it is a formal request. So you are just asking something formally when you create a petition. And then this petition that they created was called the Olive Branch Petition, as it is said here in the text, the Olive Branch Petition. And so what was this Olive Branch Petition? Well, it did a couple things here. Okay, so one of the reasons that they sent the Olive Branch Petition was because they were trying to avoid war. It says in that first part, I'm not going to highlight that too, otherwise it'll take off what I've highlighted already. So first of all, they wanted to take one more chance to try to avoid this war. Now, that seems like a kind of funny phrase, to avoid war, because they're already in a war, right? They've already been fighting battles. So it's not really going to be avoidable at this point anymore, but perhaps they would be able to end it more quickly if the king accepted this offer from the colonists. Secondly, then, it assured the king that the colonists wanted peace. And that's why they called it the Olive Branch Petition, because the olive branch is traditionally a symbol of peace. And so they wanted to, reach the king, and just with the name of the petition itself, let him know that they really wanted to have peace between Great Britain and the colonies. And in the petition, it asked the king to protect colonist rights. So the things that they're asking for as far as protecting the rights are to not put taxes into place without their permission. And we talked about that slogan, right? No taxation without representation. They weren't saying no to taxes in general. They were saying we shouldn't be taxed unless we approve of those taxes, or unless we have a representative on Parliament so that you can get our side of what it's like to be in the colonies. And again, they also said that they should be able to tax their own people within the colonies. So they weren't completely saying no to taxes in general, because again, even though we don't like taxes, they do serve a purpose. There is a good reason for us to have taxes that we need to pay. And number 5, how did King George III respond to this petition? So it tells us here in the last couple sentences that he rejected the petition. So what that means is that he refused it. He didn't even actually read the petition. He, again, is playing the role of mom and dad, right? Great Britain is mom and dad have had it. They don't want to hear any more excuses or any more stories from their kids saying, we promise we're going to be better. He said, nope, enough is enough. I'm preparing for war. And so that's what he did. He prepared for war by hiring 30,000 German troops who were going to join the British Army, who he already had many of them stationed in the colonies. And these German troops are often called Hessian soldiers. Now move into the next page here. And under the war heats up, we're looking for what did Washington realize about the colonial militias? So Congress learned that the British troops in Canada were planning to invade New York. The Americans decided to strike first. A unit of patriots marched north from Fort Ticonderoga and captured Montreal. However, an American attack on Quebec led by Benedict Arnold failed. Washington reached the Boston area in 1775, a few weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British held Boston, but Patriot militia ringed the city. Although the size of the colonial force grew every day, Washington realized that the men were disorganized and lacked discipline, the ability to follow strict rules and procedures. Washington began the task of turning armed civilians into soldiers. So, Washington, what did he realize about militias? And it tells us here, Washington realized the men were disorganized and they lacked discipline. And so for that reason, he decided that he would train them because it wasn't a lost cause. They could be trained. I don't want to say this too flippantly, but anybody could become a soldier. You just have to have the right training. And so just because they weren't disciplined and organized didn't mean that they could not become that. So Washington said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try to make our militia stronger by training them. As you're writing that, I'm just going to finish out this section under War Heats Up, even though we don't have another question. So Washington also needed weapons. He arranged to have dozens of cannons hauled 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga. Moving the heavy guns was a huge effort. In March 1776, Washington believed his army was ready to fight. Under the cover of darkness, he moved soldiers and cannons into position overlooking Boston, where the redcoats slept. So we are going to now move toward independence. And here we go. Oh, actually, I'm going to finish out this part too. The move surprised the British, who realized that they were now within easy reach of Washington's big guns. British General William Howe commanded his soldiers to board ships and withdraw from Boston. On March 17th, Washington led his jubilant troops into the city. They watched as the British troops sailed away to Halifax, Nova Scotia, a part of Canada. Okay, and now we're moving toward independence. And number one, what did Thomas Paine do? So I will read here. Many colonists held on to hope that the colonies would remain part of Great Britain. Still, support for independence was growing. It was inspired in no small part by a writer, Thomas Paine. Paine arrived in the colonies from England in 1774. He soon caught the revolutionary spirit. In January 1776, he published a pamphlet called Common Sense. In bold language, Paine called for a complete break with British rule. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. And that was part of what he had written in Common Sense. Common Sense listed powerful reasons why Americans would be better off free from Great Britain. The pamphlet greatly influenced opinions throughout the colonies. So what did Thomas Paine do? His big thing that he did was here published a pamphlet called Common Sense. And in that, he was calling for a break from Great Britain. And And then in the last part here, it said that the pamphlet greatly influenced opinions throughout the colonies. So that's what his pamphlet accomplished for number 2. He greatly influenced opinions throughout the colonies. So it says he influenced them, but it doesn't specifically say how he influenced them. So I want to make it very clear that he won many people over to the idea of independence, that breaking away from Great Britain was the right thing to do. And he did that by 3 main arguments in his pamphlet, Common Sense, which are not listed in the text, so I'm going to give those to you. The first argument, he said, is that the colonists have nothing to gain by staying under British rule. And they've seen that over the past years, that Great Britain has been putting laws into place that were not for the good of the colonies, that Great Britain wasn't listening to what the people of the colonies wanted. They didn't have any representatives in Parliament. So what exactly were they getting from staying under British rule? Nothing. That was one of his arguments. The other is that there are a lot of disadvantages for having Great Britain as their leader. And one, it's a small thing, but it's also sort of a big thing in a way, is that it's 3,000 to 4,000 miles away. How can you rule or give guidance over people if you're that far away from them? And remember, again, travel took a long time to get from Europe to America. So to send them any information or give them any guidance or give them any direction was going to take months in order for them to get that information. And we can, again, go back to that mom and dad and having the child comparison, that mom and dad live a whole other country away from you and they're trying to control you. It's not going to work, right? And there's definitely going to be problems with the children who are so far away. They're not going to do the things that they're supposed to be doing. And then that's going to lead to more problems with the parents. And then we have, he criticized the idea of having a king or a queen and this idea of absolute rulers, and basically that it's outdated and that there shouldn't be one ruler to make the decisions for all of these people. He is not representative of all of these people who are under his rule. And so he really made people think about these things, which then made them think that it was a better idea to break away from Great Britain and become an independent nation. I'm going to leave that there for a moment so that you can get that information.